Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from where you are joining us. My name is Samuel Sharo, and I work with the Department of Animal Breeding and Genetics, Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, Ogun State in Nigeria. I'm also a postdoctoral scholar at Indiana University, Indianapolis, in the US, and I work on the welfare and behavior of poultry and farmed insects. You are all welcome to Animal Welfare Group Nigeria with the acronym AWGN. This group was founded in 2019 after a gathering of students, lecturers, and researchers at the Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, Ogun State in Nigeria. And this group has three missions. The first mission is to increase awareness about animal behavior and welfare in Nigeria, in Africa, and in the world at large. And the second mission is to foster collaboration and networking among researchers who are in the field of animal behavior and welfare. And the third mission is to educate the public on the importance of animal welfare. You see us doing this on social media, talking about the importance of animal welfare and behavior, and telling people just to do the right thing. We are not activists, but we are scientists. So I want people to take note of that. And we meet every first and third Wednesday of every month to discuss issues that are related to animal behavior and welfare. And people from different parts of the world have presented on issues that are related to ethical practices, slaughtering, fear, stress, neuroscience, archery practices in poultry, one welfare assessments method, pain, behavioral genetics, and others in animals. And when I mention animal, I'm talking about livestock, wildlife, pets, insects, and fish. And today's presentation will be the 18th in the virtual inaugural lecture series. And today's presenter is Dr. Jeremy Marchant from Global Animal Partnership. Dr. Marchant will be talking on welfare certification standard, the past, the present, and the future. And today I'm going to be the host and also the moderator. And before we start, I'm going to be reading Dr. Marchant's bio. And I want us to take note of this. Please feel free to drop your question for Dr. Marchant in the chat box. He's going to attend to all of them all after his presentation. So his bio. Dr. Jeremy Marchant is the Chief Scientist, Organic Plus Trust, with responsibility for Global Animal Partnership Welfare Certified Program. He was previously a research animal scientist with the United States Department of Agriculture, specializing in welfare and behavior of pigs and dairy cattle. He obtained his PhD on gestating sow welfare in Professor Bloom's group at the University of Cambridge Veterinary School. His major research interests have included social and maternal behavior of sows, the manipulation of pig behavior by diet, factors influencing piglet mortality, and environmental enrichment in intensive pig production. He also has a major interest in the development of novel indicators of animal welfare and in supporting animal welfare science and scientists in less developed countries. He has published 4 books and 280 referred articles and abstracts on farm animal welfare. He was the inaugural specialty chief editor for the Animal Behavior and Welfare section of Frontiers in Veterinary Science and is a past president and honorary fellow of the International Society for Applied Ethology. So Jeremy, we hand over to you. You share your PowerPoint, then you go on with the presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Samuel. Let's get this into presentation. There we go. So I'm relatively new in this job. Like Samuel's reading of the bio said, I was previously a research animal scientist with USDA. So my focus for the first, 33 years of my career was very much research. And this is a different kind of role. I was already on the scientific advisory committee for Global Animal Partnership. And I interacted actually with them from when they were founded. Um, so I'm quite well versed in how they've developed over time. But what I'm doing now is really being in charge of writing and revising standards, and it's quite different from the work I've done so far. So it's been a good learning process for me. It's always good to learn new things. Um, Animal welfare is important all over the world, and this is data out of a paper we did that included Dr. Sayun as well. And we find that wherever you ask people the welfare of farmed animals, and as Samuel said, not just farmed animals, companion animals, wild animals, um, is very important. And well over three-quarters of the people in Nigeria, for example, think that the welfare of farm animals in Nigeria is important. And we also asked the question, if I could afford it, I would, pay more to buy products that are kinder to animals. And again, 70% of people in Nigeria think that as well. So a lot of people around the world, they say always, not always matched in reality, but in terms of what they say, they would pay more for products that are kinder to animals. Well, how do we identify products that are kinder to animals? And one way we hope is producers signing up for welfare certification standards that will give standards that will make them produce their animals in certain ways. So how do consumers become so aware of how livestock are raised? Really, I kind of talk about the intensification trigger. I mean, if you think about, if you ask people how they picture in their head how animals are raised, they still go to these kind of pictures, green fields, animals out there, small scale farming, family farms. And of course, the reality is really quite different. From a historical point of view, agricultural production has doubled over these types of time spans. It took 100 years to double there. It then only took 30 years to double, 15 years to double, and another 10 years to double. So we saw that ramp up of production, and especially post-war, post-Second World War, that is. There was definitely a lot of incentives for farmers to move towards intensive housing systems. When you fly over the United States now, I look around, as I'm flying, and I try to sort of guess what the farms are that I'm flying over, because so many of them look very similar. You can see from these pictures, what might this farm be? Well, the giveaway is that you've got slurry pits, you've got feed storage area there, and you've got these things which are the milking parlors. And so we know that this is a dairy cattle farm. This one, long, low, single buildings. This one is going to be poultry, and this is going to be broilers. No slurry lagoons because they're litter-based systems. This one again there is a slurry lagoon here. We've got taller buildings. This one will tell you that it's a laying hen farm. So these are likely battery cage houses in here that have got extra height. Another one, finally, big slurry lagoon is going to be a pig system. So you can see that, you can begin to tease out what the farms are, but it's very difficult because obviously you're not seeing any animals at all. All the animals are housed indoors and being quite intensively reared. I guess the only one that is slightly different over here would be beef. But even then, if you go to the big picture on the left, and the yellow square is then expanded on the right. And what that is showing you is there we've got this beef feedlot system, and we've got probably 700 plus pens of 200 cattle. So we've got, 150,000 cattle in one place. So again, really quite intensively reared, but slightly different in that they're not building reared, they are being reared outside. Also, when you look at history in terms of where this growth has happened in the last, 60 years, I guess, the major growth has been within Asia, where we see in 1960s it's way down here. And when we go up to 2018, we see this massive increase in terms of production. Other North America and Europe, really, we haven't seen a huge increase in production over that time span. We're seeing increases in South America, Central America, Africa, and Oceania, but nothing like Asia yet. And ultimately, this is a pig farm in China, which I think is, if you count the stories, it's probably about 25 stories high. Is this any worse than having 25 individual buildings? Not necessarily, but there's, in terms of for the pigs inside these buildings, but in some ways it's just, to the human, it kind of looks like it looks worse. Not sure that it is necessarily, but it's like, my goodness, is this what we've come to? Sky rises, skyscrapers for pigs. So not surprisingly, the more people know about farming systems, the less kind of happy they are with them. It was a very influential book published in the UK back in the early mid-60s by Ruth Harrison, who was not an animal scientist, but was very, very influential. And this book was serialized in a major paper in the UK and led to public outcry when she was, beginning just to investigate intensive farming systems. And the government established a committee to investigate this further called the Brambell Committee. And ultimately, in fact, there was some legislation that came out of this, which was the Agriculture Miscellaneous Provisions Act in 1968. This book is still very relevant 60 years on, and you can still pick up copies of the newer version. It's also got some commentary in there from people like Marion Dawkins, John Webster, Bernie Rollin, David Fraser, Don Broom. Like I say, really still very relevant. And when you look at some of the comments within this book, here we go. For example, most people tend to be ignorant of the processes by which food reached their table. Again, very true today. The book itself called for a ban on battery cages, veal crates, tethers, slatted floors. So some of the most intensive types of systems that we continue to use in various countries. Again, she was very forward thinking, I guess, when you think that this is 60 years ago, and yet we're still kind of got these issues that we are still working on. We still have cages, we still have crates, we definitely still have slatted floors. The Brambell Report itself was set up to examine the conditions in which livestock are kept under systems of intensive husbandry and advise whether standards ought to be set in the interests of their welfare, and if so, what should they be? Also, as part of this report, there was Appendix 3, which was by William Homan Thorpe, who was actually Professor Broom's PhD advisor at Cambridge. And this was called the Assessment of Pain and Distress in Animals. So this was really the first time that, kind of the science behind what has become the science of animal welfare was really mentioned. And so it was emphasizing this importance of scientific evidence and the links between pain, discomfort, stress, behavior, things like that. The other thing that we must thank the Brambell Report for was 5 freedoms. These 5 freedoms are very different from what they evolved into, but these are known as Brambell's 5 freedoms. And so in this report, it was stated that animals should have freedom to stand up, lie down, turn around, groom themselves, stretch their limbs. So 5 freedoms. Of course, over time, that very definitely changed and was expanded upon. And this is how we know what this is our current understanding of what the 5 freedoms are and what they mean. That's John Webster. This version is John Webster paper 1994. And so we get to this stage whereby we think, okay, so we've got increased public understanding. We've got this idea of animals should have 5 freedoms. And this is really where we had the start of welfare certification standards. And the 5 freedoms directly influenced that first welfare certification scheme, which was set up in the UK in around that time that paper with those most recent version of the 5 freedoms was published, 1994. So Alistair Muse was the chief veterinary officer of RSPCA at that time. Martin Potter was like one of the head farm animal scientific officers who had also done his PhD with Don Broom at the University of Reading. And they were working with Mike Baxter, who at that time was based up at SAC, Scottish Agricultural College. And together they kind of came up with this idea that, well, why don't we have a welfare certification scheme? And it started off, they wrote the first standards. Pigs, I think, was the very first one. And I did actually input a little bit of feedback into the writing of that particular standard. So I guess I was really into welfare certification right at the start. And the scheme was called Freedom Foods because it really was based on this idea of the 5 freedoms. And more species standards got published. They changed their name in 2015 to RSPCA Assured. So it's not Freedom Foods anymore, but this really was that first welfare certification scheme. And it spawned, a whole lot of others. And then when you think about what we have currently, there's a lot of different welfare schemes scattered all across the world. We've got RSPCA Australia down the bottom. Not surprisingly, RSPCA Australia followed on quite quickly, only a couple of years after RSPCA Freedom Foods happened in the UK. Likewise, SPCA in New Zealand, that one, 2000, one of the early ones. American Humane Certified over here in the US also started fairly early. And they were really taking those RSPCA ones and applying them to the US. So they weren't necessarily really writing their own standards at that time, but using the RSPCA Freedom Food standards. And then you see some of the other labels that you might recognize, especially if you're over here in the US. Those ones are kind of pass-fail. You reach a standard and you either are allowed to use the label or you're not if you don't reach the standard. Other schemes, of which Global Animal Partnership is one, have come up with the idea of different levels. So Better Leven in the Netherlands, for example, is a 3-step welfare scheme. The one on the right is the Danish national one. So that is different, whereas most of these are kind of separate NGO organizations or labeling schemes. This one is actually Danish and is government run. And we'll touch on that in the future as to something that might happen. But in this case, we've got different levels. So the idea is that, 2-star would be better than 1-star, 3-star would be better than 2-star, and so on. And for the GAP program, again, we also have, we call it a 5-step scheme, but it's slightly confusing because it's 6 steps. We have 5 plus. But again, a whole range of different levels, that down at one end is better than commercial production, and then at the top end is much better than current commercial production. But we don't just have welfare certification, we have lots of other certifications as well. The top 3 here are in the US. The dairy industry has its own, the pig industry has its own, the beef industry has its own, but these are not really welfare certification. They will include some elements of welfare, but they're more looking at the overall quality. So it's a quality assurance type of certification. United Egg Producers, again, in the US, we've got grass-fed. We've got other ones which will have standards, again, that will include some elements of welfare, but that is not their main purpose of being. They are more about quality. And then you've got other labeling, which is more misleading. All those previous labels, there are standards that have to be met in order to use the label that you are given. for things like this, there are no standards, so retailers, I guess, are able to put these types of labels on products on the shelf. They really don't mean anything. There is no auditing that is carried on. And so even something like humanely raised, you can put that on your product without actually having a standard that will ascertain and confirm that your product has been humanely raised. Lots and lots of labels. So where are we in terms of the present? Like I say, multiple welfare certification schemes. Question asked over here on the right, do food labels create confusion about animal welfare? Yes, they do. Quite honestly, they do. There's a lot of consumer confusion, really not sure of what these labels mean and what the different schemes mean. And we know, certainly when you look through the different welfare schemes, that not all schemes are equal. We have different standards for different things and different ways of verifying that the farm is meeting that standard. Certainly, we're open to things like humane washing, i.e., that you're still supporting intensive animal agriculture, and by giving it a kind of humane or welfare certification, you're not doing the animals any favor. PETA in the US are very, very active in terms of attacking RSPCA Assured, especially in the UK, and also attacking the advocacy groups who have been part of our journey. And of course, with any of these schemes, you've got a risk of filmed non-compliance, and that's certainly been the case for most of the welfare schemes out there at one time or another have had those kind of videos released, showing bad things going on farms that are supposedly welfare certified. So who are GAP? We are an animal welfare certification and labeling program. GAP is short for Global Animal Partnership, tax exempt non-profit. And it was started by the founder of Whole Foods Market, which is a sort of top-end supermarket food retailer in the US. It was started back in the early 2000s, but by 2008, it was more independent from Whole Foods and existing as a standalone NGO, basically non-profit. So our mission is to drive meaningful continuous improvement of farm animal welfare through multi-level standards, development, application, and verification across the supply chain. Don't worry about that. Our scope is fairly broad. So not only do we have the standards, we then accredit certifiers who do the auditing for our standards. We have product licensing and supply chain involvement about labeling, making sure that everybody product is segregated properly and everything is labeled. And we offer partner support, with all these partners. So we're offering partner support to the producer, we're offering partner support to the certifier and to the retailer and everything in the supply chain. For us, in terms of what is animal welfare, what are we trying to achieve? I'm sure you all know there's these three basic schools of thought in terms of animal welfare: health and productivity, emotional well-being, natural living. What we are trying to do is to hit the sweet spot, which is kind of in the middle, really, where they overlap. So we're drawing in for elements of all of these ideas, and we like the WOA description of animal welfare. They've got a slightly different, what they would term as their definition, but when you look at the rest of the writing, so an animal experiences good welfare if the animal is healthy, comfortable, well nourished, safe, not suffering from unpleasant states such as pain, fear, and distress, and is able to express behaviors that are important for its physical and mental state. So again, that description is really encompassing all three of those schools of thought and meeting somewhere in the middle. And that is, when we're writing standards, is what we are trying to attain, is to hit that sweet spot. And of course, the five freedoms themselves have evolved. And now, there is much more emphasis on the five domains rather than the five freedoms. So whereas the five freedoms had the five things set out separately in terms of the five domain model, we have four of these domains feeding through that mental domain. So again, it's really placing emphasis on, how the animal feels in any given situation. And for its overall welfare state to very much include that mental domain. So like I said, 5-step animal welfare standards, which is in fact 6 because we have 5+. We are tiered science-based standards developed to provide farms and ranchers with a platform for change. So originally when they were set up, it was very much thought that people would come in at the bottom and over time would move up the step levels. Nice idea, but in practical reality, it hasn't happened that way because at certain points you have key barriers to making change. So if you think about things like the poultry production and pig production, down this bottom end, steps 1 and 2 are still indoor housing systems. When you move from 2 to 3, you're meant to then go from an indoor housing system to one that allows outdoor access. And again, from 3 to 4, outdoor access could be, a fairly small, not particularly well maintained lot. It could be dirt, it could be outdoor bedded packs, that kind of thing. 3 to 4, 4 becomes pasture, and pasture again is quite a different type of system. And so there are natural kind of barrier points in some of these standards for people to be able to move up. And that's an element that we need to think about when we move into the kind of future side of writing standards. In that case, what are we going to do to have this consistent increase in animal welfare? If we have these big barriers, how are the ways that we can overcome this and still see an increase in welfare without farmers hitting a barrier that they can't cross over? So obviously the standards are written so that they are there for the entire life cycle. Certain other things that are key to all the standards, even from the baseline set of standards, no added hormones. It's not a no antibiotics ever standard. Obviously we want animals to be treated. So the encouragement is there to treat animals with antibiotics, to do the necessary, to do right by the animal. But if you do treat animals, those animals are not allowed in the GAP program. But the producers are not allowed to put no antibiotics ever, because this is a whole area that is subject to intense scrutiny in the US at the moment. And some of those pressure groups have looked at taking samples of meat that have got things like no antibiotics labels on them and testing them and finding antibiotic residues. So unless you as a scheme are doing that antibiotic residue testing and proving that there is no antibiotic residues in the products, you cannot put a no antibiotics label on your product. Also, we're not feeding any animal byproducts across all our standards. So standards for the entire life cycle, more space than you would expect in commercial production, safe, so we're not only increasing the space, we're working on the quality of that space. We're expecting environmental enrichment. As we move up the steps, we're expecting access to outdoors, to pasture. We use third-party certifiers. Some of the welfare schemes do not use third-party certifiers. They use certifiers who are employees of the scheme. This, we think, gives us independence in that, we have no vested interest in whether a farm passes or fails. Whereas other schemes, maybe there is an economic conflict there. And we are auditing every single location every 12 months. So again, some of the schemes do not do that. Some of the schemes, when we have a group products system, or a kind of cooperative, they will let the cooperative do most of the audits, and they themselves will only come in and audit maybe 10% of the operations within the cooperative, for example. We don't do that. We go in and audit every single location. We need to have that verification through the supply chain. So obviously the source farm and ranch is all stages from production, from birth to leaving the farm. That is audited. We've got to make sure that all product is then segregated, so that our animals, when they arrive at slaughter, are segregated from non-GAP certified animals, and that the product, as it moves through the processing facility and out to further processors, is always segregated, so that we assure that when it arrives on the shelf in the supermarket, that product bearing the label is traceable all the way back to the source farm from where it was derived. How do we set these standards? We do want to be science-based, so standards are set right from the work that we do as research scientists. You know, we are trying to use that science and apply it in the field to improve the welfare of animals. But we would draft standards. We would produce what we call pilot standards. We would do some field testing with the pilot standards, get lots of feedback, collaboration, revise, and then when they finally go out as non-pilot standards, we obviously have approval, but we've been through this process. We're not just putting a standard out. We're making sure that we're following key steps in order to get a standard that is practical, workable, and is improving welfare. We set up species advisory groups. We include producers, researchers, associated industry. We do have a scientific advisory committee that helps us with all our standards. And we have the GAP board, who are a unique mix of stakeholders, and they are the ones that vote on the standards and approve them. The Scientific Advisory Committee, this is it currently. We've got pictures of 9 of them. Vari Sutherland literally just came on last night. So the idea is that each of these individuals will have particular species, welfare expertise, and also some of them, like so Vari, who has just come on, and Abby Viscardi, have a lot of multi-species experience, but work very closely on pain. And that's one aspect which I think is really, really important in terms of our standards. But you can see they're mostly based, they're based in where most of our certified operations are: North America, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. But a great bunch of people with lots and lots of experience, really good to work with. Our board of directors is a mix of producers, retailers, advocates, independents. And like I say, we write the standards, board votes to approve. And so this diagram sums it up quite nicely. We've got all these different actors who have vested interest in welfare of animals. What we hope to have is a board of directors who come from different directions, different actors within the whole sphere of animal welfare. But we're writing standards that obviously they have to approve, so that they are acceptable to all of those different groups. So there's certainly some compromise involved in that. But it's, again, great team of people to work with. And it needs a super majority, so it's not a simple majority at the moment. So you visit our website. We've got all our standards out there. So any of the standards that you want to look at are readily downloadable. And they'll turn up like this kind of idea. We'll have step levels over here with the dots representing that the standard applies to the step level. Some of which, are across the board, apply to all of our step levels, and then others you will see our step level, what we call step level differentiators. We have a mixture of welfare inputs and outputs. So most of the welfare certification schemes are, looking at elements of management, looking at elements of resource, the environment, but then also looking at the outputs, looking at measures of the animal. And I think that's going to be increasingly important, and I'm going to touch upon that. So what do we mean by that? So these are ones out of the dairy standards, for example. So heifers must not be bred until they're at least 55% of expected average mature weight across all step levels. So that would be an example of a management indicator. Dry lots, we've got square footage, minimum square footage per cow. That would be a resource-based measure. Body condition score. All animals must display an overall body condition score of at least 2 on a 5-point scale, and 4-point scale for calves and heifers. So that one would be an animal-based measure. So you see the idea that this is how standards are written generally, that we've got different aspects of the whole system that we are looking at, but especially including elements of output. Animal-based measures are very important. So here, for example, key factors for broilers. So comprehensive base standards apply to all step levels, and then other standards would differentiate between step levels. So for broilers, for example, step differentiators might include elements of lighting, stocking density, access to perches, the amount of enrichment, outdoor access, pasture access. And this is the way all the standards are set up for the species. Similar kind of idea. Base standards applicable to all levels, and then individual elements that will differentiate, that will be different and will differentiate across the steps. So here, for example, we might have broiler production. You would expect that probably that one there, an indoor-based system with some enrichment, would be certified to about a step 2 level. This one here with some outdoor access would be a step 3. And then when the outdoor becomes high quality and we're out on pasture, you would expect it to be step 4. So there you can see kind of, quite different types of systems and where they might fit within the certification scheme. So in terms of our process, an interested producer would submit an application. The farm would prepare for an audit. The audit would be performed by that third-party certifier. The auditor themselves don't set the step level. They collect all the information, and a reviewer working for the certifying company will assign the rating. And then obviously the standards need to be maintained until the next audit 12 months later. Not 15 months, 12 months we've moved to. So they go to again, anyone can go to the website and see the application form and the kind of information that it asks for. And then in terms of preparing for the audit, there is also what we call audit preparation tools, also freely accessible on our website. And so the producer themselves can download the audit prep tool, and that's basically going to ask a series of questions relevant to the standards. And the producer can go through and, tick yes or no. If they're getting lots of ticks in the white boxes, then that's not good. Those are elements that they've got to think about and see if they can change. If they're getting lots of green boxes, then that will tell them that their farm is probably looking pretty good. And it's divided out into the different step sessions as step requirements as well. So they'll begin to get an idea of where they will fit within the step scheme. There's lots of records that need to be kept. All those templates are on the website, and the records have to be ready to show the auditor. I won't go through the list, but just saying that there's lots, there is a fair amount of paperwork that is needed to be kept. Like I said, we have third-party auditors. We work with 3 different companies. We work with Earth Claims primarily in the US. They do some auditing down in New Zealand as well. Livestock Integrity Solutions, Australia, New Zealand. LRQA are auditing primarily in the UK, also doing some of our South American operations in Uruguay and Chile. the auditor will tour the farm. Ideally, it will be done with the person who actually manages the animals. They don't want the person who maybe owns the farm but doesn't do the work on the farm. You want to be able to talk to the person who is caring for the animals. They review the documents. They have an exit interview, asking more questions and filling in the audit form. They will not be able to tell the producer whether they have met a certain step level, but they will focus on practices that have a potential to impact animal welfare. They're looking at all those things. They're asking questions. They're reviewing records. They're touring the farm. They're getting a really good understanding of how that farm is managed and how those animals are being impacted, because they will be taking some of those measurements in person on farm of those animal-based measures. They then submit all the information to the reviewer, and that reviewer is the one who makes the step level decision, and the certificate is issued, which you see on the right-hand side. So, so if there are elements that are what we would call non-conformances, so where the producer is not meeting certain standards, if they are major, then that's a big issue. If they are critical, then that farm will not get certified. If they are major, that's a big deal. And obviously these things have to be corrected in order to be passed. If they're minor, they're given time. They're usually given like a 30-day period to make that change, and then it has to be not necessarily re-audited in full in person, but it has to be checked on to make sure that that non-conformance has been addressed and that the standard is now being met in order for the certificate to be issued. So from my point of view, what are some of the challenges? Well, some of the challenges that I'm finding is that, of course, we keep animals in all sorts of different systems and in all different parts of the world. So even when we've got 5+ steps, it is still very, very difficult to write standards with a one-size-fits-all model, given that geographic spread, which includes very different climates. And even then within geographic areas, and certainly between geographic areas, we've got very big husbandry system variability. And of course, we have cultural differences. If we're working in different countries, in different continents, we have different cultures for sure. And in some cases, different religious aspects, which are also playing into parts of the standard. So the map on the right gives you an idea then of, this is over in the West Coast, Northern California. And there are a lot of farmers over this way. If you're located in certain areas, like if you were probably halfway between these two endpoints, you might well be able to keep your cattle in one place for the whole year. But we find that in a lot of cases over there in the West Coast, we have farmers who are operating in two different places, geographic locations. We've got upland pasture where they go to in the summertime, where the climate is a good temperature, and grass is growing for the whole of that summer period, but it then gets too cold in the winter, so they relocate them down to the lowlands, which is their winter grazing and winter location. And making sure that our standards fit that type of system, where we thinking about transport, for example, ordinarily we wouldn't like to see transport of unweaned calves. We wouldn't like to see transport of pregnant cows within their last trimester. But some of these elements don't work well depending on how that climate happens relative to calving time. And so these are some of the variations and some of the thinking that you have to do when you're writing standards, looking at the different husbandry systems. And of course, we have North America, but we're also operating with a lot of beef and sheep producers in Australia, for example. extensive, vast farms measured in terms of square kilometers, not in terms of hectares or acres, but we're talking square kilometers when we come to farm size. And a lot of the farms are based in, central parts of Australia. And yet the two yellow circles that you see there are the slaughterhouses. And they need to use those processing plants because these are the ones that are cleared for export to certain countries. That the countries that they are exporting to have given those processing plants the necessary certification to be able to export to their country. And so you've got very, very large distances. And bearing in mind that under national legislation, animals are allowed to be trucked for 48 hours without access to feed and water in Australia. Obviously, that type of allowance would not be permitted within our welfare standards and are not. But we're looking at ways to safeguard welfare over long distances if we're operating in a country like Australia, for example. So these are some of the challenges that you've got, in terms of thinking about, does one size fit all? And this is actually a photo of one of those operations in Central Australia that our auditor took as he flew in to it. I mean, it almost looks like a model, but this is the real thing. So this is what in Australia we would call road trains. So these are the big transporters that will at least do the first stage of the transport, getting the animals from Central Australia to rest depots closer, and then they would go on to different trucks to travel the rest of the way. But you can see the kind of the vastness of the property in terms of what we're operating with. So other challenges, well, if you're adding requirements that might have cost, and that cost is not being met by extra revenue, then of course that is a challenge. So pain relief, for example. So here is pain relief being given for disbudding. In an ideal world, we would want to have pain relief for all painful procedures across all step levels, especially when we are the ones that are causing the pain in terms of our husbandry procedures. And we would like not only short-term, but long-term. And that comes with difficulties because a lot of certainly analgesic drugs, for example, are not approved for use in agricultural animals. And so that means that the farm has to, they can use them off label or extra label use, but that includes jumping through a number of hoops for them to be able to get access to those drugs. And of course, it includes extra cost. And are the producers going to be rewarded for that? And if they're not, then obviously they're quite resistant to incurring things that will give extra cost. Other things that we come up against that might be challenges are added requirements are in opposition to advice coming from other sources. So certainly we've found within the dairy industry, where we of course are pushing for pair and group housing of calves and early access to forage, we are coming up against alternative advice that the farmers are getting from their veterinarian and from their nutrition consultants. So these again are elements that can be quite challenging. And also, I mean, there is still a genuine lack of understanding the reasoning or the science behind some of these added requirements that we are asking for. So that's where we're up to. And if we want to then take a bit of a glimpse into the future, I'm thinking that there's going to be, more globalization. We do already have global in our name. I know Certified Humane are working pretty globally. There's a lot of course, there's a lot of intercountry trade. And so, many of our Australia and New Zealand operations are being specifically certified because they're importing into the US. Also, we're finding that there are some global companies out there who, operate globally, and they are expecting food produced to the same standards wherever they source. Why, if they're sourcing ham, for example, in the European Union, why should those pigs be reared differently than the ham that they're sourcing in the US, for example? So there is a global coalition for animal welfare. There's retailers. There are Sodexo, Aramark are big kind of food service companies. Nestle used to be part of this group, as did Starbucks, actually, but I think they've dropped off fairly recently this year. But these are groups that are, again, looking at this from a global perspective. And in fact, while I was working for USDA, I was doing some work on environmental enrichment. And that was at the request of Nestle, who were part of Coalition for Animal Welfare. And like I said, they actually own most of this kind of the freezer pizza brands in the US. And so they were sourcing things like ham, pepperoni, whatever for their toppings, chicken, even toppings for their pizzas. They were being produced under different conditions in the US compared to the European Union. And they want to know why. They're beginning to put pressure on their suppliers to say, we expect our pigs to have access to environmental enrichment, for example, those kind of things. So there is a global way of thinking that production systems should be similar. So I think in the future we're going to get more tailoring of standards. I mean, I'm not particularly, having been trying to set standards myself that are applicable across the world, I realize how difficult it is. So even though the Global Coalition for Animal Welfare might want something, they've also got to bear in mind that animal agriculture is different in different parts of the world. And so we might, in fact, be ending up with tailored standards that are relevant to continent, but then also maybe relevant to country within continent, because again, things are different. We talked briefly about cultural differences. So if I'm working in Asia, clearly within Asia we have some Muslim countries, for example. And so working within Muslim countries, and when it gets to things like requirements for slaughter, these give you certain challenges. And so it might be that you have to have a set of standards that are specifically applicable to Muslim countries within Asia, and others which might be applicable to Hindu country, other that might be applicable to Buddhist country, for example. That's just one. Yeah, that's one example. So different by country. But then even by locality within country, we know that from working within the US, that the West Coast beef production is very different to the East Coast beef production and the central beef production. And you're trying to write standards that fits everything. And like I said, maybe even we're going to have companies that we're going to say, these are the standards that we want specifically. Changes in labelling, going back to that idea of government labelling within Denmark. We know we have consumer confusion, where we have those accusations of humane washing, different verification, different rules. Maybe we're going to see more governmental, I was going to say interference, but I don't mean interference, government being involved in, setting welfare standards, trying to guarantee welfare within country, or even across country. Maybe there'll be a European Union wide idea. We know we have different systems in different countries. Maybe there will be a push towards unifying those so that we have, recognizable label that everyone can look at and say, we know what this means. And I think that's going to happen. And then from our point of view, as we write standards, and this is the last slide, shifting towards more of a focus on animal-based measures, those output measures. You can do all the measurement in the world in terms of space, access to feeders, all these kind of things that are resource based and management based. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is the impact of any of those elements on the animal. And so, whereas we do have animal-based measures in our standards, my personal opinion is that we need to increase these, and we need to be focusing more on those. and making sure that the physical health and things like the behavior that we can look at. These can be quite difficult to do on farm. I'm sure a lot of you are probably aware of the welfare quality project, which was a big EU funded project, that did produce some amazing documents that give you an idea of how to assess on-farm welfare. But these can become extremely time consuming. And so you've got to be picking animal-based measures that are good iceberg indicators, I would say, that are easy to measure, and aren't going to take 2 or 3 days for the auditor to actually go through the farm and measure. The other thing we need to be shifting towards is we're good at measuring elements that indicate bad welfare. We want to be shifting towards measures of positive welfare and measures that are telling us about how that animal is feeling. There's a good couple of papers here at the bottom, if you're interested in this particular area, that you should look at. One by Anthony Delmal, one by Frank Tuchens in Belgium. These are really good papers, and they begin to talk about some of these elements of what we should be thinking about as we move forward. It also said one of the challenges is coming up against the producer and not fully understanding why we're asking for what we're asking. And I think we do need to incorporate more producer education within our documentation, and actually work with our producers more to get them to fully buy into why we are asking them to do these certain things. But the other thing we also want to do is, there's another paper that recently came out this year that looked at dairy farmers in Germany specifically, and finding that, how do you get producers to improve welfare? It's really not by necessarily giving them standards that they have to adhere to. You again need to get their buy-in, and you need to motivate producers to be able to make changes. How do you do that? You educate them. You start using benchmarking. You start showing them how they are stacking up to, I won't say their competitors, but their peers. Benchmarking within peer groups, for example, is a good way to motivate producers to work harder to improve welfare. And so there are definitely things that we can do, definitely science that can help us do all these as well. We're expecting welfare science to come up with good animal-based measures. We're expecting social science to get us to know more about what motivates producers to improve welfare. And so, yeah, I will leave it there. So those are some of my thoughts on past, present, and future. And now, lastly, I've got that one that I just added that bullet point in late last night. Increased risk management. So the final point is that any of these schemes are auditing producers once a year. So that a particular farm is working to your standards on the day that they are audited. There are now another 364 days of the year where you don't have that guarantee. Again, another reason why we have to get that producer buy-in, because we want that to decrease risk. The risk of these undercover types of films coming out, that when we're not there watching what the producer is doing, the producer reverts back to things that they shouldn't be doing. So increased risk management is going to be increasingly important as well, because without it, we lose trust, we lose public trust. And it doesn't take much to lose public trust. It takes a long time to build it, not long to lose it. And that is it. I will happily take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that wonderful presentation. I'm going to ask you this question. The last part, you talk about increased risk management. I'm like, is there no way you can ensure after-day welfare evaluation? Like, you go to the farm for welfare evaluation on a Monday. How do you make sure that the farmers are doing what they should be done after that. There should be a way of ensuring that.
Yeah, I mean that's the biggest thing, Samuel. It is, um, and like I say, we don't. Really, the only thing that welfare certification schemes have is a threat to do an unannounced visit. So most of the welfare, I'd say probably all of the welfare certification schemes, have that written in that, yes, expect your annual audit, but we retain the right to visit you anytime. Usually they're not completely unannounced. An unannounced audit will mean we give you 24 hours before we turn up. Um, so we're not going to. There are things that you can improve in if you're given 24 hours. You could suddenly turn up and say, oh, the bedding is low. I can put the bedding in so that it's up to the right level again for when they come tomorrow. But there are certain things which again then comes to that focus on animal-based measures. If you are playing more importance on animal-based measures and you turn up on an unannounced audit, you should be able to see from the animal-based measures that things have not been kept up to the standards that you require. But this is why I also say that you've got to get buy-in. You really have to. You don't want the producers just to think, I'm just signing up for this scheme because it gets me a little bit more money when I sell my product. You really want them to be motivated to do the right thing to improve animal welfare. How do you do that? You interact with them more. You don't just you make sure you have resources for them to look at. We are constantly under the auditing scheme. We are collecting a lot of data, and we're not necessarily using that data, from us as a standard setter. When the auditors come in, they walk around the farm, they're filling in paperwork. They're filling in if there are, non-conformances, standards that aren't being met. What I don't know is, are there certain standards within my document which are consistently being problematic to producers? If I knew that, then those are things that I can focus on. I can produce resources that will help farmers overcome those difficult standards within our standards. But yeah, getting real producer buy-in is the main thing, making sure that the farmer is always doing the right thing, even when nobody is watching. And those are things that we definitely need to work on, and definitely in my plans for the future moving forward.
Thank you very much. Vijay is
Mm.
asking about the humane endpoint for farm animals like poultry.
Sorry, say that again. Humane endpoint.
So Vijay from India is asking what is the humane endpoint for farm animals like poultry?
Is he meaning on farm? Are you meaning on farm, Vijay?
So maybe based on GAP welfare standard.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, and you've got well, so in our standards, so like for poultry, for example, a broiler farm, we have mortality in there as a standard, but mortality in that term is animals that are dying. So we would still expect the farmer to walk through and do the necessary culling. So culling is not part of a standard. So they are not being penalized for culling, because if you start doing that, you start penalizing the producer for culling. They are maybe not going to cull when they should cull. So it's important to make sure that that doing the right thing at the right time is not part of a standard, because you don't want to pressure those producers to not do the right thing at the right time. So you would expect their humane endpoint to be, whatever you would expect their humane endpoint to be. We're not specifying that. Obviously, we expect all animals to receive the correct treatment, and we expect animals and birds to be euthanized appropriately. If they are not improving when they are being treated, then that decision needs to be taken in a timely fashion, and the animal needs to be euthanized using approved methods that we do have in the standards. But yeah, we're not penalising for that kind of decision making. We very definitely want the farmers to make the right decision at the right time. Hope that answers
Okay,
your question. Yeah.
thank you very much. Another person is asking about the possibility of rearing animals without the use of biologics like antibiotics. The person is wondering how that is possible because sometimes there will be disease and you have to treat the disease.
Yeah. Yeah, that's that's one of those standards that we've debated a lot, both internally, and externally with our stakeholders as well. I don't like no antibiotics. I think for me, and I think so our issue is we if animals are treated with antibiotics in our standards, they are no longer eligible to be GAP certified. So that kind of goes against what I just talked about in terms of euthanasia. You want to support the farmer doing the right thing at the right time, and treating animals correctly and with the right drugs at the right time is something you want to encourage. I'm definitely a bit worried that welfare certification schemes in general usually have this kind of no antibiotic policy, because they don't want this sub-therapeutic continual use of antibiotics. They don't want overuse. Really, what we should be having within our welfare certification schemes is responsible antibiotic use policies, in my opinion. But that is only my opinion and not the opinion of GAP, obviously. So GAP, as it stands at the moment, has this, treat the animal and it has to drop out. I don't like that. I think it's important that we should encourage responsible use of treatment for sure.
Okay, thank you very much. I was looking
Mm.
at the scientific advisory committee. These are faces that I know. So
Yes, of
how,
course. Yeah.
what,
Mm.
yes, what, what are the criteria for selecting these people?
Um, well, I've selected them because I know them generally. I know who I'm working with. I know I can work with them. They're colleagues that I've worked with in the past. So, and they're good. More importantly, is that they're excellent scientists and they're knowledgeable scientists. Like I say, I've kind of picked individuals where I know I need species expertise. Um, so like I say, I've just recently added. So Caroline Lee from Australia is a fairly new addition, and Vari Sutherland from New Zealand is a fairly new addition. Because we have lots of certified operations in those countries. And so again, when we had the conversation, Samuel, about different localities and different farming systems in different countries, I don't want to be completely North American centric, because when I've then got questions about beef production in Australia, I don't have anyone within my scientific advisory committee to go to, unless I've got expertise from there. So as we expand, I'd certainly be looking to, like we've just been auditing our first poultry operation in China. We've been auditing poultry operation in Malaysia. So as we expand into different geographical areas, then I would be looking to introduce, the expertise from those areas as well. So that's why when you look at that, we're still primarily North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, because that's where the bulk of our certifiers are. Yeah.
So when you were presenting, you were talking about different welfare certification bodies using different systems. Is there
Yeah.
no way all this can be harmonized so that we can have a standard that all of them will be using? Or is it based on countries, continent, or what? Because I'm like, all these certification bodies can meet and adopt a framework, and they point out that this should be the standard we are using. Are we using 3 stars? Are we using 5? Things like that.
So that's a nice idea, Samuel. Yeah, nice idea. I mean, at the end of the day, these certification bodies are all. I mean, they're a mix. There's a mix of ones like us who are non-profit, but there are also ones that are not non-profit. They are for profit, and so that automatically means that you are competitors rather than working together. So each of those competitors has come up with the standard that they think is. I mean, they're doing it for the right reasons. Obviously, they're doing it to improve animal welfare. Um, but different companies will have different ways of doing that, and different methods, different standards that they need to set. My minimum bar might be higher than somebody else's minimum bar. They're going to write the standard here, thinking that, well, we get producers in and they're improving welfare. We might want to be, well, for us, there are elements of that standard which the welfare is not high enough, and we need to be higher. Um, so yeah, it's a nice idea to, but like I said to you, it's also contributing to that confusion. At the end of the day, people are looking at labels and really don't know what they mean. And if there was more standardization, and I think it will begin to come. I mean, definitely, I know the UK government, for example, is thinking about it, about being involved in it and coming up with, benchmarks that producing some kind of national label scheme that will let consumers know what the welfare is within certain systems. I'm a fan of levels. I do like levels. I'm not necessarily a fan of the number of levels that we have within our scheme. And again, it was one that we've had sort of internal discussions about. I like the simple Danish system. I like the simple Better Leven system of 3. I think 3 is a good number that gives us a good idea of good, better, best, that kind of idea. I think that makes it more simple and more clear. And, maybe we will get more of a consistency across certification schemes as we move forward. But yeah, and ideally, I think it would be good to do that because, like I say, at the moment, it's confusing. It is confusing. And there isn't an overarching body of certifying groups. There's not a society or association that we could all join, that would start doing that kind of thing. And I think there probably should be. So when you start it, Samuel, we'll join.
Okay, thank you very much. Somebody's asking this. I don't know if you want to answer this, but I know you left USDA. You now work with an NGO. It's asking if there's a PhD position in animal welfare from your hand.
Yeah, nothing with me anymore. No, I mean I'm not involved in
Yeah, I know you
PhDs.
left.
Yeah, and obviously in the US at the moment, it's very difficult circumstances in terms of funding across the board. I mean, you're based in the US, that a lot of the federal government funding is very
Yeah.
uncertain at the moment. And so
Mhm.
I suspect there are far fewer PhD opportunities at the moment within the US than normal, but hopefully it'll come back again.
So thank you very much for that.
Mm.
Thank you for answering that. Somebody's asking that she wants to know the criteria and the challenges in implementing welfare certification standard. I think you mentioned that. Do you want to go over that in another 30 seconds so that we don't deny that person?
Yeah, challenges. Yeah, I mean, I know she's saying that she maybe had a network glitch and so didn't see the.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, I did go over this a little bit within the presentation. So at least if the recording becomes available, you'll be able to see some of that. But yeah, definitely some of the biggest challenges that I'm finding now that I'm writing standards is trying to come up with a standard which is a one size fits all, because we're working with so many different producers using different husbandry systems, that's a major challenge for me is to write a standard that is broadly applicable. And then other things that are challenges are sometimes the standard is going against advice that they're getting from a veterinarian or their nutrition consultant. Other challenges, biggest challenges, cost. If there's a cost implication to a standard and they're not getting the benefit or premium price for their product that is matching that cost, then that is always going to be a challenge to get a standard implemented.
Thank you very much. Jeremy, I'm looking at consumers' education. When I go to stores, there are a lot of things that are written as welfare certification labels. And I believe some people don't understand this. Is there a way all these certification bodies can try and educate consumers so that they understand what all these labels mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a whole area, Samuel, for sure, that has been, it's definitely always been talked about, but and we think about ways that we could improve that. You could you've got such traceability that you can go as far as labeling a product on a shelf with a QR code that can be scanned and will take you to the farm, a virtual visit of the farm even. But it's a lot of effort to put that in. It would take money, and would it really be used? I mean, there's certainly the social science that does keep asking some of these questions about what is truly important to the consumer. I'm not sure there's enough social science done with the labeling. I mean, we do know that it's confusing, but it's like okay, so we know the consumer is confused in the store. How We haven't really done the research to try and figure out how to improve that or eradicate that confusion. And so it's definitely a gap. Whether the certification bodies themselves are the ones to fill that gap, again, it would be quite an investment in order to do the research to find out what works. But it's difficult it's just difficult. We know that consumers are bombarded by labeling. Like you say, you go to the store, there are so many different types of labels, and you don't truly know what they mean. Point of sale information, I think it has limited value. I really don't know how easily we get through to the consumer. A lot of the certification schemes, we don't advertise. We're non-profits, so we're not advertising necessarily. We're not doing that kind of marketing. We're not doing the education type of marketing, that's for sure. You don't see adverts for us on mainstream TV or anything like that. Maybe we could get inserted more into social media types of advertising, but people click away from advertising. So yeah, it's a tricky area to address, but one that would be useful to have more information on, is to really grasp an understanding of how to educate the consumer.
Funny question from me to you, a very funny question. So I discovered that whenever we go to the store, all these products with welfare certification labels are always more expensive. Why?
Because what you're asking farmers to do increases cost. I mean, it does. You're increasing cost, and that cost has to be recouped from somewhere. And so one would hope that the farmer is getting paid more, and all those steps up the food supply are absorbing some cost, but at the end, the retailer likewise has to absorb some of that cost and pass the cost onto the customer, onto the consumer.
So one last question from me. For GAP, what is the process of integrating new animal welfare research into the existing certification standard? Maybe you have new things that you want to introduce into what you have already. What is the process like?
Yeah, the process is, so we have two processes, I guess. So we have what we would call updates. So we can update our standards on an annual basis. So that can, that's not a major rewrite, but it might just be, tweaking individual standards when new information comes out. And then every 4 or 5 years, we would expect to do a full revision of a standard. And in that case, we would take a deep dive. We would open it up for public comment. So we would want all stakeholders to tell us, what do you think should be addressed within the current standards? Is there new science that maybe we're not aware of, that you think should be incorporated into the standard? What are things that you're finding complete that are real challenges to meeting? Are there things that we should change? Should we increase our stocking density, decrease stocking density? Should we increase, certain things, the amount of perch available to chickens? So any of those could be written into this open comment period. And then that is when I would get together with a species advisory group, and also the science advisory groups to again deep dive into the literature, and into the comments we've received, and work through the process and revise standards as necessary. But annual updates would be at a much lower level than that, and ones that, again, if anybody's got anything that we think should be included, we're open to receiving comments at any time, on particular standards. And if there's new science that anyone has put out that they think that we should look at, let us know and we'll look at it, because it's very difficult for us, obviously, to keep an eye on all new science that's coming out across all species at all times.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. From our audience, if you want to ask some other questions, you are free to do that by using by raising up your hand. Use that symbol so that I can bring you in to ask our speaker some questions. If you want to ask questions, you are free to do that. Just signify. Okay, so nobody wants to ask you a question. So
Okay.
One last thing before we go. I'm looking at these three things. I'm looking at scientific evidence. I'm looking at producer practicability, and I'm looking at consumers' expectation. So whenever you are setting this welfare standard for certification, how do you balance these three things? Scientific evidence, I know you do a lot of science, then consumers' expectation, then practicability of all these standards that you are setting. How do you balance these three?
Hopefully, because of the process that we've got, we want that whole of that process to, when we're revising, when we're writing standards, to involve all those groups during that whole discussion. So, we're not coming up with a standard that I think should be applied. It's already had all the input from those different groups. of course, there is going to have to be compromise. Compromise is the magic word for this. You cannot. I guess a good way of looking at it, Samuel, is that if everyone is slightly dissatisfied with the standards, you've got it right in some ways. Because everyone's going to have those different expectations. If one group is completely satisfied and the others are dissatisfied, then you've got that balance wrong. So what you want to come up with is a standard where everybody got something that they wanted out of it, but didn't get everything. And that's kind of the best that you can hope for. If you ever manage to write a standard where every single group is happy, retire. I guess you've done it. You've won. I think it's a very difficult ask. The best you can do is to reach that compromise across all groups. And it takes dialogue. I mean, that's what you want as well. I always, as a research scientist, I was always very happy to talk to everybody. So, if Humane Society were calling me, I'd talk to them. If the National Pork Board were calling me, I'd talk to them. As a scientist, one hopes that you should always be open to having those discussions, because you can act as that bridge between producers, and consumers and advocates on the one hand, producers on the other. And I think I've always managed to do that, and still doing it in this job, which is great. To be able to sit and have those discussions with everybody is really important. And so dialogue and compromise. Dialogue and compromise, are probably the key words. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm noting that dialogue and compromise. So thank you very much, Jeremy. And I know that everybody enjoyed this. And I want to thank everybody for participating in today's talk. And we are so grateful to have you join our meeting today. And Jeremy, thank you very much for that. And I appreciate all our participants. And we hope to see you in our subsequent meetings. So you can join us on social media. On Twitter, that is X. Our Twitter handle is at AWGM14. AWGM in capital number and 14, capital letter and 14 in number. Then you can also join us on Facebook and LinkedIn. Our Facebook and LinkedIn name is Animal Welfare Group Nigeria. And you can also watch our past webinars, inaugural lectures, and panel discussion on our YouTube channel. All you need to do on YouTube is to type Animal Welfare Group Nigeria, and we have more than 60 videos that we have uploaded on that. So I appreciate everybody. Abdulrahman Safian, thank you. Merihan Ajayi, Oluwashem Vijay, thank you for joining us. Ebunluwa, Vito Yenirian, Asunduwa, Omalaya, Matthew Weto, Gideon Ajibola, Toyin Bwezikaya, Damilola Adebambo, Odeyemi Adebisi, Lukoya, Akinyemi, Ajayori Oluwa, Vitalis, Emmanuel Oke, Grace, Jeremiah, and everybody. Thank you, and thank you so much. Bye.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.